Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, we hear from Ben Aaronovitch and Jonathan Stroud, two stellar names in the world of British fantasy. Aaronovich's Rivers of London series has become a runaway success, and Stroud is author of the acclaimed Lockwood and Co series. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, Aaronovitch and Stroud talk all things urban fantasy and mystery, reimagining London in their work and their journey from shelf to screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So you can see we've got one fan taking photos already. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and a special thanks to the great people at the Bradford Literary Festival and the staff at Waterstones. I mean, we come here and we talk, but there's a lot of work that goes into making these things happen, so we are very grateful for that. And thank you all for coming out. So tonight's going to be a conversation between Ben Aaronovitch and Jonathan Stroud. I'm kind of the third wheel here, or the chaperone maybe.
The grown-up in the room.
The grown-up in the room. But in case anyone's been sort of like in a coma for the last decade or so, I'll give you a quick intro. So Ben Aaronovitch is the best-selling author of the Rivers of London series. And Jonathan is the author of the Batimer sequence, Lockwood and Co, and Scarlet and Brown. I don't think you need more than that. The idea behind this is, I think by the end of this thing, everyone in this room should be able to write their own best-selling fantasy novel, right? That's what I'm going for. So, Ben,
no pressure.
No pressure. You have a history with Waterstones, the bookstore. Does it feel good to be back in one?
Well, this particular Waterstones is fantastic. If I'd worked in this Waterstones, I wouldn't have quit.
And can you tell us a little something about how Waterstones got you started in the Rivers of London thing?
Yeah, that story. I ran the science fiction and crime sections at the Covent Garden Waterstones. And I was working in Waterstones because it's the least bad form of retail. I hate work, by the way, that's the baseline. And I will do just about anything to avoid it, but unfortunately, I live in central London, and so therefore you need money. And so I was working there, and I'd been there for about a year, and I realized I was shelving people I'd never seen before. And all of these people had been published in the year that I'd been working at Waterstones, and I thought, oh, look, it must be really easy to get published. Before you say that's the naivety of youth, I was 47 at the time. So I really have no excuse for thinking that. And so that's when I decided to write the books, was because of that. And as I said, I was writing the crime and the science fiction fantasy section, so I couldn't be bothered to write two books. So I ended up writing the books that I did, and that's the story about that.
Yeah, okay.
But this is so nice. I would have written a completely different book if I'm being real. Slightly more enlightening, I think.
So number one is get a job in Waterstones. But Jonathan, you have a darker past.
Do I?
Yeah, because you started out in editorial as an editor for Walker Books.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Yeah, and so how does the farmer become the meat?
Yeah. The gamekeeper becomes the poacher. Yeah. Well, it's sort of weirdly there's a sort of symmetry, isn't there, between us, so that we both sort of flipped over. So I started out in publishing, and I was editing other people's books, which was a really good education, and I would recommend it. I mean, I'm really happy that I was an editor, but at the same time, I also started to get a bit of frustration and thinking, I could do this, I could write that, why not? And I in my spare time, I went home, and probably a bit similar to Ben, I went home and started scribbling away, and just little by little put together my first novel. But it took a few years. I mean, I think there's definitely a pattern, isn't it? It's helpful to be in the world in some form, whether you are in publishing or in a bookstore. You are immersed in it. So it's probably not a coincidence that we've both snuck in through the back gate somehow.
Well, it helps if you like books.
Yes, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, because it takes ages to write the bloody things, and so you've got to really think, oh, this is worth it. I've produced something that thick that most people would use as firelighter in an emergency.
Did you write it sort of when you went home after a hard
No,
day's
I got up
work?
at, oh God, no, I was knackered. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do it. And as a result, I'm now perpetually stuck in that kind of morning cycle, whether I want to or not.
Right.
Because before that, I was a night owl, and now I'm a morning person. And people go, "Oh, you're a morning person." The trouble is, by about 10 o'clock, I go to sleep wherever I am. It's like, oh.
So it could be quite a difficult hour for you, potentially.
Could be. Well, I'll be fine. I drank a lot of coffee.
Okay.
I usually have like a bottle of Diet Coke or something specifically for that reason. I forgot to get it, so still in the hotel room.
But in order to do this as well, do any of our audience have to move to London? Because your work is primarily set in London and it's been like really successful. I mean, would anyone read fiction set in Bradford, or it has to be the big city?
There are entire sections of Waterstones that are devoted to books. Admittedly, they're mostly pictures of women in headscarves looking like this over the meadows and hills and dry stone walls. But there are entire sections devoted to places other than London.
Yeah, and
You'd be surprised.
You've moved out of London in the series, as we will discuss maybe a little later on. But can you tell us something a little bit about writing about the city and what it means? Because your work, when I first encountered it, one of the things I loved about it was it felt like being taken around this tour by this dodgy tour guide. And you couldn't really understand whether what they were telling you was true or not, because there was this blending of myth and things that might be factually true in the world that we live in.
Well, I try and do about a 90-10% split. I mean, apart from the magic, obviously. I have been guilty of making up the odd pub every so often. Or the most egregious thing was when I moved a lingerie shop, which was in Notting Hill, and I moved it to Soho because I didn't want to send Peter all the way out to Notting Hill. And also thematically it fitted better in Soho. And I just kept the entire shop as it was and just moved it to Soho. So I like to do that sort of thing. I'm a Londoner, so I'm from London. I mean, if I'd been from Manchester, it would have been set in Manchester. If I'd been from Bradford, it would have been set in Bradford. But I'm a Londoner, so it was set in London. All cities of any antiquity in this country have just got a massive history that you can draw upon. You should know that. You're mining Edinburgh for all it's worth. But London is my city, and it's my advantage that it's a well-known city. There are only a certain number of cities that are internationally famous, and London is one of them. So, you set something in London, you get a lot of immediate draw. But the reason I set it in London is because I'm a Londoner, and I'm lazy and don't like to travel. So,
I think that's true, isn't it? Probably for everybody here who's a writer, you have to write about what you know. So,
hang on a minute, you're not from London. You're from like St. Albans or something like that, aren't you?
Well,
you get this a lot, Tender. You get this a lot with London, right? It's always attracting people who come in and write about it.
It's true.
Then they burn it down and then they move out.
Yeah, that's
It's just a common,
I've done that.
pattern.
Yeah, I've had genies destroying it. I've had ghosts infesting it. And in my Scarlet and Brown books, I flooded it with a big lagoon. So actually, yes, I have done various dodgy things to London, but it was the nearest glamorous city to me when I was growing up. So yeah, it's my enchanted place as well.
And so as you are building this world, because one of the things that you seem to specialize in, John, is this weird, mashed up atmosphere that you create in which there's elements of the past, but it also feels like we're in the future. As a reader, I tend to get a bit confused as to where I am in space and time when I read your work.
Is that a good thing?
It's disturbing in a good way.
Yeah, no, I guess that's true, and it's different from, say, with Ben when I read Rivers of London, and I feel very, very sort of confidently in the kind of here and now, or in the very recent past. And I suppose with my stuff, I tend to, in a way, it's the easy way out, because I will always think of it as being an alternate. It's an alternate history that's been going on for centuries. So I can kind of make it contemporary, but my version of contemporary is going to be something that has different rules. So you've had a pandemic of ghosts for 50 years, therefore London will be different, and you won't have half the things that we experience. But you will have kids going around with jeans and trainers, but they'll have swords as well. So you can kind of mash things up in a way that is kind of satisfying, and kind of hopefully gives the reader kind of an immediate, when you read a couple of pages, you're instantly in that, and you can sense that it's different. You can sense that someone has thought about the rules, even though I'm sort of paddling desperately trying to sort of keep the rules from not falling apart. I don't know what you guys do. Do you sort of make it up as you go along? At what point do you
it's that
know how
thing
it
you
works?
always have with contemporary fantasy. You have to decide whether the masquerade is in place or the masquerade isn't in place, and you decide the masquerade isn't in place, and so therefore you have to then work out what are the consequences of having an epidemic of ghosts for 50 years. Whereas I have to work out why the masquerade is in place, which is why in my series magic destroys mobile phones, because otherwise it would all be on TikTok. The whole thing would be on TikTok. So you have to say, why isn't it on TikTok? Why hasn't the ubiquitous camera systems in London picked up any of these ghosts? You have to work out all those kind of details, and that drives the story in one way, whereas you drive the story in the other way by saying what has happened when there's a pandemic of ghosts for 50 years.
Yeah.
And that requires people to do certain things and requires certain institutions to be set up.
Getting rid of technologies is a very good tip, I think. I think in my first Bartimaeus book, somewhere in it, embedded in it, in one of the early chapters, there's reference to a magician using a computer. And when I was working on the second book, I realized this, and I knew it was a complete balls up, basically, because there was no way you wouldn't have a computer, because everyone had been using magic for centuries. That was how you got things done. And so that was the one and only time that I made that sort of error of judgment. So no phones, no nothing.
You see, for me, the fun is when you take the contemporary world as it is, as realistically as possible, and then you mash it into the fantasy. So for me, part of the fun for me is Peter Grant having to work within the actual constraints of being a police officer, and then having to deal with ghosts and werewolves and things like that. The example I always use is the werewolf. You see, if Peter arrests a werewolf, takes him into the custody suite, right? Now, for a start, the custody sergeant's going, I'm not putting that hairy thing in one of my cells, right? But if he does, is he violating the animal cruelty acts? But if he takes him down an animal shelter, is he then violating his rights under the European Convention on Human Rights? And I love the idea of Peter having to work that one out.
Yeah.
Well, this is also one of the things that I love in both your series, plural, because we seem to have all this fantastic stuff happening, but we always get dragged down to sort of the rules and bureaucracy. You both seem to have this interest in the rules, because DPRAC is very bureaucratic, and the Metropolitan Police is they're very rules-based and stuff. So how do you sort of create that effect, and what rules do you bend? Sort of what real-life rules would you bend?
All societies that operate under systems, right? And all systems operate under rules. And there's no getting away from it. This started with basically, and has gone on since. And so therefore you either fight against it like you do by destroying all the rules and upsetting all the things and going back to people just doing what they want half the time within social conventions, or you say, what are the impact on the rules and of the rules on the world that I am creating, and his is the impact of what are the impact on the rules, and mine is the impact of what is the impact on the world that the rules that I have made, that the rules that we have are on the fantasy world, and you play with it, it's fun.
But I think that's the key, actually. That there's that bringing the rules and the bureaucracy and stuff in it's a source of comedy, and for you and for me also. It's I don't know, fantasy is an interesting sort of area of fantasy that you can either take it very, very seriously, or you can take it seriously but also bring in humour. And a lot of the humour in my books, and I think in yours as well, comes very much from that collision between the mythic forces or the incredible paranormal, scary stuff that's going on, and this kind of very mundane, rules-based, petty, sort of very ordinary, real sort of aspect of life. And it's constantly the two are rubbing up, and that just makes things far more fun, doesn't it?
Yeah, because my original pitch in my head, I never pitched it to anyone like this, was what if Gandalf would join the Sweeney? Right? And I just really like the idea of like, oi, Saruman, put your trousers on, you'll knit. that was like the impulse for me. Like, I thought the Lord of the Rings would be much shorter.
So does the humor emerge from the work then, or is that the writer's quirk a part of your personality that seeps into the work?
I really stuffed the humor seeps in, you can't get out.
I don't know what. I think humor is key. I mean, for me, I did 2 or 3 novels way back, and then for me it was a kind of revelation when with my character Bartimaeus, the Bartimaeus books, and it was literally one day when I sat down and I started writing in the voice of this 5,000-year-old genie who he's the narrator, and he starts telling jokes pretty much on the first page, and on the second page he uses a footnote because he thinks he's far cleverer than anybody who's actually reading the book, and he's got all this sort of this great knowledge and thousands of years he wants to tell you all about it. And sort of within I don't know, half an hour of sitting down, I had sort of suddenly had realized kind of the writer that I could be, and I hadn't figured it out before, but actually the fact that humor was really quite a key part of my sort of personality. And presumably similar with you?
Yeah, well, no, as soon as I wrote Peter, I mean, that just set the tone for everything.
Yeah.
And that kind of jokey, cheeky, cockney, emotionally repressed tone went through the whole thing. And it's great because I don't know, it worked. I wrote the first 4 pages and thought this will sell. So I thought, ha-ha! And then it's just a question of sitting down at bloody 4 o'clock in the morning and writing the rest of the bloody novel.
How long did it take you to write your...
That was the fastest I've ever written anything, because there's nothing like going bankrupt as a motivating factor there. So I did that one in 5 months, but I've never written anything that fast
5
ever
months.
again. Yeah.
5 months for a novel, that's good going.
It's not bad, is it? Especially it's the longest one of the novels. And then there was that whole faffing around of a year trying to get an agent and bloody sell it and get it past editors.
Hey, editors aren't so bad.
Fortunately, I discovered various ways of getting around editors, right? The first way is to hand it in really late. Right, and then
I'm trying that now, actually.
They don't really have time to fix anything, so you just like they can do like the little details, but those big sections where they go, we want you to take out the middle and replace it with a dog or something, they just go, can't do that. And so you just basically get the book you wrote, good or bad, spelling mistakes and all, gets published.
That's a good tip. You guys are getting good tips now. That's excellent.
And then when you get big enough, like we are now, you just go, I don't think so.
Your accent changes, does it?
I don't know about you, but I think that's the third section is perfectly fine.
I'm not tempted to do that with any of my publishers just yet.
No, well, you see, you have to get to a certain stage first. They have to want you. No, because it's a ruthless world. I thought, I was aiming at middlist, so everything else that happened after middlist for me is gravy. Because I didn't think I was going to give up my job. I thought I was going to stay in the job and this was going to just help me out. But then it became ridiculously successful to an extent that I'm just surprised every time I'm reminded of it. And so that's what happens. I don't have any experience of being any other kind of writer because I just went straight from nobody to big in kind of like the space of about 2 books. And so like everyone goes, well, what do you do about this? And I have no fucking idea. That never happened to me. So I can only tell you what it's like to be me, which is great.
But poor Jonathan had to struggle.
Well, I had my apprenticeship. No, I think yeah, I'm trying to think back now. So I'm so ancient. I mean, it seems like a long time ago. But yeah, I did lots of books, but they were picture books to start with, picture books and puzzle books. My first books were attempts to do Where's Wally, because when I started, Where's Wally was the best-selling children's book in the world, and everybody in the publishing house wanted to replicate this, and I was no exception. So I did lots of books which were that kind of ilk, and that was a fantastic sort of education in how to spend a lot of time on making a book that didn't sell very many copies. But it's all good. I mean, it's all about finding your own voice. And for me, it took. I wrote 3 novels, and in the 4th novel, I found my voice. You found your voice miraculously and irritatingly in your first book.
Well, no, you see, because you forget that I actually spent quite a long apprenticeship myself writing for television and writing novels.
Oh, hold on. Okay, so yes, it's not the full story then. Yeah.
So because I wrote all the Doctor Who's, and I wrote novelizations of the Doctor Who's, and tie-in novels for the Doctor Who.
Okay.
And that was great because I made all my stakes on a series of books that have now been pulped. And so therefore are not available for anyone to go over. Unless they go down to the British Library and get like the 2 copies that still exist.
Which is fantastic. But at the center of what you're doing, it seems to me the character comes first. You've got these interesting stories and plot lines. But if I think about Winter's Gift, which is the newest novella that's come out, we've got Agent Kimberly Reynolds. One of the things that I've noticed is we've got Peter narrating Rivers of London, and he's got his own quirky, funny voice. The October Man is tonally different. Then we've got Abigail's books, which are different. But they've got like it's this youth slang and talking foxes and
present tense.
Exactly. But there was a really marked tone shift that I noticed when you set this book in America. Can you tell us something about creating character and voice and how those two come together?
Well, that's a really difficult question because, a character is often a multifaceted thing, and you think you know what the character you're writing, and then when you start writing them, they turn out to be a different character than what you're thinking. And then what you get rather good at is like corralling your characters to be more like the character that you thought they were going to be, while not losing that kind of spontaneity. So the thing about Kimberly Reynolds is she's from an American Midwest evangelical background. And the trouble with that background is if you describe the way they talk, the way they actually talk, it sounds like a parody. It sounds like something out of Spitting Image. So finding a way that I could write her where she doesn't come across as a parody of herself was the problem with that one. But once I kind of licked that, then she became much easier to write. And then she started throwing in things that I wasn't expecting her to do, like her jokes and then falling in love and things like that, which I didn't plan at the beginning of the book, and stuff like that. And it was fun. I enjoyed doing it, but it's very hard to do American because it's actually much harder than you think it is. Because you assume because you're steeped in American culture, you can just write an American character, but they actually have nuances of grammar and things that you don't think about, like gotten and losing the S's off things and things like that you don't actually notice. You remember the pavement to sidewalk stuff, but you don't remember the kind of subtle stuff. Yeah. And so I don't think I'm going to do that again. That was a lot of work. I'm going to stick with people I understand, like foxes.
But it's also well done, and it seems the Americans handle magical problems radically different.
Well, there's no point doing stories set in a different place if you do the same story but in a different place, So, I mean, America is essentially the Wild West for magic. So, I mean, ironically, and also it's got a different history, you see, because in Britain they have relationships with the river spirits, and sometimes the relationships with the river spirits is fraught. But in America, you essentially have genocide of the river spirits, and so therefore the river spirits are universally antagonistic. Because because the current population, the white population, European descended population of America exterminated the culture and exterminated the river spirits as they moved across the continent. And so therefore the relationship is bound to be different. But also at the same time, they brought in a lot of traditions from all over the world. And so therefore you're going to get that American melting pot effect. And you're going to have a mix and match. And so my idea is you have your kind of European traditions on the East Coast, but as you get further sort of You get New Orleans, which is a much more French and Spanish kind of tradition, mixed in with the African traditions. And then as you go to the West Coast, it's just a free-for-all of mad people.
and that's America. And but, Jonathan, you've also done something which is pretty diabolical with Scarlet and Brown, which is brought America here because it feels like the Wild West. It feels like a Western. So can you tell us something about building that world and sort of like the alterations? Because I'm a sucker for giant otters and other gruesome animals.
Well, I mean, Scarlet and Brown, that all begins with Brexit, really. It was kind of my response to the trauma of Brexit. I was sort of sitting there thinking I would love to write a book that had kind of my meditation on Britishness and what it meant to be British, and being a kind of slightly unhinged fantasy writer, what I ended up doing was writing a sort of dystopian Wild West British Western set in the far future, where the whole fabric of the country, the landscape has altered. Big cataclysms have occurred. The country has sort of altered. It's much more violent, much more American, I suppose, in the sense of its scale and the sort of dangers involved. And all the people half of them, most people have died, and the surviving towns, everyone is living in these little towns, and they're kind of looking inward, and they're kind of very frightened of what's outside their walls. Not unreasonably, because there are cannibals running around and giant otters and all kinds of stuff. But fundamentally, it's a kind of an inward-lookingness, an interiority, which I was kind of irritated about at the time. And my heroes, who are Scarlett and Albert, who are both young and both outlaws and bank robbers, and they cause trouble. But the reason why they're heroes is that they actually they're not afraid to look upwards and outwards, and they go out into the world and they actually face up to what's out there. And that I think is the sort of all my books actually. It's the same with Lockwood and Co, for example. That I hopefully invest my characters with the ability to look into the darkness and to face up to it, and sometimes bad things happen, but actually that's what you have to do. And so so it started out as a kind of thing to do with Brexit, but actually ended up being something more to do with my own sort of, I guess, a sort of a vision about what I don't know, what we should all be doing, and certainly what younger generation should be doing, hopefully.
Yeah. And it is a weird and wonderful vision. But I also got to thinking, sort of, having been through 3 series. I mean, reading Ben's work is fine because it's all kind of set in the same universe.
Yeah.
But you move from series to series. I mean, there are certain bits that kind of come through, which is like the author's humor and the weirdness comes through. But as you move from series to series, can you tell us what you bring along with you and sort of like what you leave behind?
Gosh, I'm sure I take certain neuroses and other sort of weird things with me all the times. That's a great question. I suppose all my books deal with. To a certain extent, it's about there's a certain cynicism or a skepticism about authority. I think it comes out in the Bartimaeus books, where the country is ruled by magicians. The prime minister's a magician, and all the politicians are magicians. And I remember writing this back sort of 20 years ago, and it still applies to this very day. The sense of this sort of ruling class of dodgy elites, and the ordinary people are there, sort of powerless and frustrated. And with Lockwood and Co, the same sort of story, but there it's very much more that the adults are the ones who are kind of locking everything down, and it's the children who are kind of enslaved, having to go out and do all the dirty work. So I have a lot of fun with this kind of essentially imbalances in society, and my heroes are always sort of trying to find some kind of balance. The same is true with Scarlet and Brown in their own way. And in fact, right at the moment, I'm sort of trying to figure out how I'm going. Book number 3 of Scarlet and Brown, trying to figure out how to kind of achieve this balance and what level. So yeah, I mean, I think there are certain themes that come through, but I kind of get slightly sort of bored. Not bored, but you follow a certain story for a certain number of books, and then usually I kind of feel like I'm running out of steam. It's better to stop it before it has I think what you're doing good things because you're jumping around. You're sort of going to different continents. You're bringing in different characters. It's the same world. It's connected, but fundamentally you're able to do something new, aren't you? And then that's a cunning move.
I'd love to say I planned it. Oh yeah, I totally did that on purpose. That's me. No, well, yes. Basically, I don't know what to say to that, except I always keep thinking it's going to end. Right? I start each book thinking, well, this will be the last one, despite the fact that I'm under contract. And so obviously it's not going to be the last one. But about halfway through whichever book I'm writing, the next book will appear. It's like every single bloody time. I have not known what I'm going to be doing for the next book, and then I'm about halfway through, and suddenly I go, oh my God, that's what the next book, and then I have to fight myself not to be writing the next book when I'm supposed to be finishing the one. It's really a form of procrastination. I'm in fact saved by my procrastination in that respect, in that my procrastination, look, this one will be brilliant, it's so beautiful, and but I have to get on with the one I'm writing, and I'm usually sick of it at that point.
It's always the way, though, isn't it? That you get to in the middle of it, it's always difficult, and then you see the sunlit uplands, don't you? Where the next book.
About the novellas, right?
I would say that.
The great thing about novellas is like that usually happens at the 40,000 mark, about 45,000 words. But with a novella, you go, oh, I finished it. And off it goes to your publisher. Yay!
Well, I think I've got you both warmed up. And that's a good point for me to leave it at. I could chat with you all night.
I have a question for you.
A question for me?
Yes, I have a question for you because you have a very appealing central character.
Yes.
And so we both agreed that the voice was very important for getting your central character going, and you agreed with us. So now you have to tell us about your central character and where that one came from, where she came from.
Yeah, it's a work of monumental genius, I think. So you've got Ropa Moyo. The Library of the Dead, the Edinburgh Night series. It started as a short story that I did in 2015 called Ghost Stalker. Sort of short fiction is my R&D department. I can play around with voice, with form, with all sorts of different things. And every so often something sticks, and you're like, yeah, I really like this character. So I'd set the story in my hometown of Bindura in Zimbabwe about a girl who talks to ghosts for a living, and it's a mundane job. It's kind of like, a spectral Royal Mail thing. And I really like the voice. That's the first thing that I got. But I didn't know if it had the legs to do a novel. Then I did another story a couple of years later. I think that came out in 2016 or 17 called The Library of the Dead, which was about using dead bodies. I'm one of those weird people that likes going into cemeteries.
Don't we all?
Yeah. But ghosts don't pop up in mine, They're not going to try to kill you or give you the ghost touch. But yeah, it was about that, and I knew the two stories were kind of set in the same universe. So I had the character, I had sort of like a central location, but when I set out to do the novel, I then decided my hometown was too small, so I went for the place that I know second best, which is Edinburgh. And it kind of just grew out of that, and from there, I started nicking, I nicked your schema. You put a bit of history in there, people love it, and you give people a certain sense of place, and you just play around with things. So that's kind of how I did it, and I'm glad it worked. Yeah.
Oh, that's very good. Very good, by the way.
But it is very good, yeah.
But before you guys turn this thing on me and start grilling me, I would really love to open it up to our fantastic audience here. And I think we've already got a question right
at the
back.
Hand up already.
Yeah.
Superb.
What made you make Lockwood and Co about ghosts?
Oh, good question. When I was young, one of the things I liked reading about was ghost stories. And when I was about 13 or so, an English teacher came into my class, and he said, "Boys, we're not going to do any work today. I want you to sit back. I'm going to read you a ghost story." And he read out a story by a guy called M.R. James, who's a great British ghost story writer from about 100 years ago. And I remember just being transfixed by how great this short ghost story was. And I went out straight away and I bought the book of this guy's stories. And so I always had that as something that I liked, and I kind of wanted to do my own spooky story. And I'm sure it's the same with all of us, that if you're going to write a story, these things have all been done before, so you have to think of a way in which you do it, but you do it in a way that's just ever so slightly different from all the other millions of ghost stories, in my case. So with me, I sat there thinking, actually, yeah, I'd like to do a ghost story, but I'm going to, instead of it just being set in some creepy old house in the middle of nowhere, and it's just one person whose car's broken down, and they've gone and knocked on the door, and they've gone in, and the door shuts, and they're alone with the ghost. We will have ghosts everywhere, and there's a pandemic or epidemic of ghosts. And as soon as I had that idea, and the fact that it was going to be children who are the only ones who can actually deal with the ghosts, two ideas in a way. Once I had those ideas, I was able to then just to sort of almost follow the logic of it and make the story.
I think we've got a couple more.
Yeah, there's more hands coming up now.
This question was originally for Jonathan, but then I thought you can answer it too, because I'm going to open it up a little bit. So, as we both know, your books are both set in sort of parallel realities, universes. So I want to think, if it was set in now, in our reality, what do you think your characters would be doing? It's like, what would George be doing? What would Lockwood, etc.? Like, for your books too, what would they be doing? Jobs, school? Would they be, I don't know, roadmen? What would they be doing? What would they be living like?
That's a great question. Would Peter Grant be a police officer? Would he?
Peter Grant had quite a glittering career laid out, which is derailed by the magic, because Neblett wanted him to do the CPU because he then he was going to promote him and he was going to sponsor him to go back to university and get a degree and then come back into the fast track, because he had images of him going up the fast track uniform. He didn't want him to go into CID, he wanted him to go into uniform, and he wanted him to go up because he just recognised how good at administration Peter is and wanted Peter to go in and do that. And so that Peter would probably be, detective, deputy assistant commissioner by now, probably. So there you go. It was a lucky escape, really.
Yes, yeah. So he would have quite a close, in a way, it's got quite a close parallel. Lockwood and Co, that's a tricky question. I think George would be he could quite easily be in academia, for example, because I think what he's good at is looking at things and thinking very deeply and quite a sort of rigid sort of, but very, very effective way. So I suspect he'd end up being in very, very learned and sort of slightly nerdy. Lockwood's an interesting one because I think his energy and his drive and his kind of publicity-orientated persona, what would he end up being?
Influencer.
Yeah, he could be. He would always have the danger of going off into something that was kind of superficial, and he'd actually he would still require to have someone like George and Lucy there to kind of bring him back into something that was actually worth doing and wasn't just a waste of his talents. Lucy, I think she could do anything. I think the thing about Lucy is that she starts off very, very uncertain about her place in the world, but actually she is formidable, and so she would be a success at something, and it could be almost anything.
Brilliant. I think we've got a question here and a couple there afterwards.
I know one of the big quotes about author, being an author is kill your darlings, but Jonathan, you've recently seen your darlings potentially being killed by someone else. How does that feel? And I know that I think, Ben, you've finally got someone who's actually going to be picking up the rivers of London. How does that make you feel, seeing someone else sort of interpreting your characters on the screen as opposed to the way they're interpreted in your books?
Well, in my case, I'm really I couldn't have had a happier experience, because the guys at Complete Fiction, Joe Cornish and Naira Park, and the other guys, they're working for years trying to make Lockwood and Co. And right from the beginning, we had a very sort of good relationship, and I talked to them and to the writers, and they, throughout the whole process, they asked me lots of questions about it. So I knew all the way through that they really were invested in it, and they kind of knew it better than me by the end. And I think their version of Lockwood and Co is absolutely superb. I mean, they've kept, in my opinion, they sort of kept the sort of integrity and the essence of the books, but then sort of added a whole new sort of level, whole new elements which are lovely. And the sort of the two key moments for me were when during lockdown I wasn't allowed to sort of go anywhere near it, but they showed me a little bit of video of Ruby, Cameron, and Ali, the three actors, playing my three main characters. Just the three of them sitting in a room together, almost like the first time they'd actually sort of sat there with a script, and they just gave me like a minute's video to watch, and I was really kind of shaking with fright when I pressed this button, because I thought, if I don't like these actors, it's going to be really quite painful. And I pressed the button and I saw the three of them, and I was just had this immense relief, because they were all sort of just so perfect in how they looked, but also you could see how good they were straight away. And then the other bit was when they allowed me to go to Ealing Studios, and I went into, they built Lockwood's house in the studio, and they really had built it, but just in chunks. And you'd go inside, and it was like being inside the house, and it was remarkably close to what I saw in my own head. And that was really eerie, that they'd read the text, and then they'd created something that was just correct, you know, as near as damn it. So yes, I couldn't have had a more happy experience with that.
I don't have anything to add to that because it hasn't happened yet. However,
What do you hope they don't do?
Television. See, I've worked in television, so the possibility of what they might do is just terrifying. But I'd just like to say that I never kill my darlings. I love my darlings. I keep them close. Or if
you rip their faces off.
Well, you know.
Yeah, fair point.
Makes her a more interesting character, I think. No, I don't kill my darlings, but occasionally I do spin them off into a separate short story or something. Because when they mean that is you get fixated on certain scenes and things that happen. And sometimes you're halfway through the book and you realise the thing that you think you're going to happen is not going to happen. And you think, oh God, that's 8,000 words I'm not going to use. And then you think, oh, I'll put it in a short story instead. And win-win, really, because you get an extra short story and you don't kill your darlings. A tip for you aspiring writers out there. Never throw anything away.
Hi. Following on from that, Ben, when it does come to materialise into a TV or even a full-blown movie, who would you ideally like to have play Peter?
I am always the wrong person to ask this question because I watch television in a very non-looking at actors way. I mean, I'm one of those people that goes, oh, it's him, that guy that was in that thing, you know, the one with the other guy. And people, and my son goes, you do realise that's the same actor that was in all those three films that you think is three different people. And I mean, is he? Okay. Well, good makeup job there. He wasn't wearing makeup. He just changed his hairstyle and you didn't recognise him. So I don't actually have preferences. I mean, I know roughly the sort of, we're going to have to get a kind of very charismatic up-and-comer for Peter and for Leslie, and then we're going to get, one of the many thousands of British character actors between the ages of about 35 and 45, of which we are not short of, really, thank God, who can play posh English people, which is not exactly a category that we're short of either. And names have been, all sorts of names have been bandied around, from Hugh Laurie to Paul McGann to Tom Hiddleston, as if Tom Hiddleston would do it for the budget that we're going to have. And they'd all really be good. I mean, but the thing is, they'd all be different. So once you cast Nightingale, you're going to have to, because you don't get an actor of stature and then just make them do something different. You have to kind of build it slightly around them. It's like when they change the Doctor, you have to build the Doctor around the character a certain way for it to work properly and to take advantage, because the difference between writing a novel is like telepathy. It goes out of my brain onto paper and then out of paper, occasionally via Cogna, into your brain, right? And but a TV series is a collaborative process. You have 12 people at least paid more than you just working in the main above the line, and that's not counting the actors. And you don't get these people in and pay them this much money unless they have something to contribute, which means you have to say at a certain stage, you have to kind of let go of it and let them get on with it. And it's not always going to be the same way you imagined it in your head. You know, sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. But that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's better, and you just have to face up to that. That's just the way collaborative processes work versus the kind
It's
of...
like having kids, isn't it? You at some point you have to let your little darlings go off into the world.
If only.
Well, or not,
These
as the case may be.
days, I had to move out. I got fed up with him, just moved out myself.
I think that will be a good point
Little
for us to
Pry bar point.
to leave it. I want to blame the people at Waterstones. They could have given us like an hour and a half or 2 hours,
2,
but we only
3,
got
Germany would have done 2 hours.
Yeah. But here we are. You both will be signing books.
So you
Absolutely.
I think there's a corner there.
get over there,
Yeah.
get your books out.
After, I mean, everyone came out to see me tonight.
Yes. buy the first one. It's really good. I honestly tell
Library
you
of the
to, by
Dead,
the way,
yeah.
because you won't be getting another one from me for at least a year. And he's doing a different series now, so you know you wanna.
Yeah, I'm your filler, guys. This is take it or leave it.
Yeah, do you want the money or not?
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Ben
Thank
Aaronovitch,
you.
Jonathan Stroud. Thank you.
Tendai Hitu.